Okay, we're going to get started in just a minute. Once again, I'm Liz Higgins. I'm an ag business specialist with the Eastern New York team. And welcome to the second week of How Profitable Will My New Orchard Investment Be? And today we're going to talk about partial budget analysis and enterprise budgets. So it should be quite a exciting afternoon of budgeting. So with that, let me just make sure I have everything set up. Once again, if you have questions during the presentation, if you put that into the chat, I should be able to see it. It might take me a second, but I can look to see that and I'll try to answer it as we go along. And there will be some time at the end of this also to ask questions if anybody does have questions. All right, so with that, so once again, the funder is Northeast Risk Management Education. And we talked last week about doing overall budgets and the importance of both doing operational budgets annually so to help you sort of be able to plan for your season, and then touched on long-term sort of strategic budgeting when you want to plan for something that you're going to do in the future. But a lot of times what you want to know is, you have different enterprises on your farm and you want to know, like, where should you invest your money? What enterprises are doing well? What's contributing to the profitability of the farm? What's not contributing to the profitability of the farm? What should you cut out? What should you add more of? So one way to do that is to develop what we call enterprise budgets to really start to dial into really focusing on specific enterprises and their contribution to profitability. But they are, they are more time consuming. They often, really to get down there, it requires, sort of more data and sometimes more making assumptions when you don't have that level of data. But before I get into enterprise budgets, one thing I want to touch on is partial budget analysis, because this is also, if you're not familiar with this technique, this is a way, if you're really trying to decide between two decisions, to make a change, and you want to know if it's likely to be more profitable. This is a good partial budget analysis is a good structured approach to thinking about whether or not a change makes sense. It doesn't, partial budget analyses don't change take account change the value of money over time. So if your analysis is going to focus on something that occurs in more than a year or two, you should also include net present value, and we'll talk about that in a couple of days. So I will cover that. This is more something if you're looking at something like within the current year or something. Although once you incorporate net present value, the partial budget analysis you can use that over multiple years. So a partial budget analysis, as I said, it's like, do I do A or do I do B? Do I use, I'm using ladders right now in my orchard. Do I change over from ladders to buying a platform system? Will that benefit my farm at all? So one of the key things with the partial budget analysis is you want to be very clear about what the change will be. And the more focused you are around that change, the more accurate your partial budget analysis is likely to be. It's a lot easier to get the numbers and do an analysis for something that's very focused. The broader your sort of analysis is, the more you're moving up into the realm of really looking at enterprise budgets or something more, because the more fuzzy or uncertain the data is likely to be. So if it's something like, do I lease this vehicle? Do I lease a car or do I buy a car? Do I hire 2 more workers, or do I get this labor saving piece of equipment? So it's often very focused, like, do I do this or do I do this? So you want to specifically write out what that change will be. And then the first thing you want to do is, like, you want to sort of itemize all of the things that you will get if you make that change, the positive added returns. So if let's say it's, do I, do ladders or do I do, do I do a platform? Well, I think if I do a platform, I will get, my yields, my harvest pack, will go up 10%. So I'll be able to harvest 10% more fruit. So that would be an added return. Like I would have 10% more fruit if I make the change. I'm trying to think added returns. I think, that's my biggest thing is I think that will add to my productivity. So I will have 10% more, be able to pick 10% more. And then you would list all the reduced costs that you would have from, from going from a platform from ladders. Well, I wouldn't have to buy any more ladders, right? So the negative on the ladders. You would have negative on, maybe I need 3 less people. I don't, so you take all the costs of doing the, making the change. But then you also have to say, well, okay, but what am I giving up? So what added costs would I have for doing the platform? Well, I'd have to buy a platform, would be an added cost. I would have to hire somebody to train the people to use the ladder. And you want to go through like as carefully as possible all of your added return and then all of your reduced returns. Like I would, maybe that's 0. Maybe it's all a positive on the, maybe I'd have 10% more damaged fruit. I don't know, like some, I would get a little bit less value, like the quality wouldn't be as good. I don't know. So then you would subtract the 2, and then you'd summarize the net effects. But then the other thing with this is you always, there's always non-economic or other factors that you want to consider that you, like when you're weighing the 2. So it could be that I don't know if I have the time to train people. So, staying with the current system would require less management in the short run. It could be that the platforms, I have a lot of older workers and the platforms would be safer for them. So that I can't really quantify that, but that weighs, there's some value to that. And you would add those other things too. So that's basically what a partial budget analysis is. It's a very simple budgeting of the returns and costs and positive impacts and negative impacts of a specific management decision. So this is an example of one, from a study that I did a few years ago. Do I buy rapid fire blight PCR test kits or do I continue to use the Hort Lab, for testing fire blight? And so the positive would be, there's really no positive, there's no added return, there's no added value that I can quantify from switching over to the PCR test. But I would reduce, I no longer have to ship samples, so that would save me $65. I wouldn't have $20 labor to package and ship the sample to get tested. And I wouldn't have the lab analysis fee for the Hort Lab. So I would be at negative 115 if I switch over to the PCR test. The negative is I gotta buy the test kit. So that would be, that I have the added cost of the test kit, and that's 8 tests. There would be time to train employees to use and analyze the test. There's the time that it takes the employee to actually take and analyze the test. And I can't think of any reduced returns. There's not going to be any sort of savings that I can quantify in here. So my net, I'm at negative 115 for switching over, and the negative would be 100. So right now you can see that it's a negative $15 if I switch over to the PCR test. But the other factors I'd want to consider is that the PCR test is immediate. So even though it's a little bit more expensive, I get the results immediately, and there could be some benefit to there that I haven't quantified. Whereas the lab test takes 5 days to get a result. The PCR test includes 8 tests. Even though we only usually send 1 sample off per year, it might encourage me to do more testing and have better management. The lab, on the other hand, the lab gives results to us that are explained, whereas the PCR test requires the employee to do the test, right? So there's a little bit there. So I would look at those and I might decide, okay, even though it's $15 more upfront to do the PCR test, the speed of getting the test result is worth $15 more to me, and so I still decide to go through. So that's an example of partial budget analysis, and this is a very useful technique for businesses to use as far as making these sort of do I do this or do I do this types of decisions. So, having an enterprise budget can make doing partial budget analysis better, as I'll show you in a few minutes, because it helps you sort of collect the data that you would need to both, to do a partial budget analysis. And I'm going to talk about enterprise budgets, but also enterprise analysis, because they're really, you do an enterprise budget, but an enterprise budget leads to enterprise analysis. And an enterprise budget is a listing of all the income and expenses that are associated with a specific enterprise. And an enterprise, and we've defined this earlier, it's any activity which results in a product used on the farm or sold in the market. So it would be your profit centers is an enterprise. And once again, you can those can be defined differently. An enterprise could be apples as a whole, depending on your business. It could be fresh market apples. It could be processing apples. It could be Honeycrisp, a specific, a variety of apple. It could be a class of apples like club apples. It could be apple pies, because once again, you also have an apple pie making enterprise in your business, right? You get the raw materials in to make pies and you sell a pie. Cider making can be an enterprise. Grading, packing, and shipping apples, so that's like take the apples in, and then that's a whole nother set of things that you do to sort of add value to those apples that are brought in, and then those are sold. So that could be an enterprise. You might want to divide your farm into sort of the production enterprise and then the packing and shipping enterprise. So those are enterprise, and an enterprise budget is what is, all the specific income and expenses around whatever you've defined there. So why even bother doing this? As I said, they really provide a basis for more in-depth financial analysis of your business. By analyzing revenues and expenses, you can determine which enterprises you should expand and which ones maybe should be cut out and eliminated. And then you can use that data also for creating partial budgets when you want to make management decisions about specific changes, quickly. By having this whole system enterprise budget, you'll have the data at hand to do a lot of better data available to do partial budget analysis also. If you're in an orchard system, a lot of times we talk about like an enterprise budget, but an enterprise budget has to, there is an assumption within that enterprise that you have a set of, of revenue and you have a set of costs. But as you know, when you have a multi-year system like an orchards, you have very different sort of revenue and cost structures for different years, sort of in the development process. So in general, when we see enterprise budgets, a lot of times it's sort of, there's this assumption that you're at full production within that season. But if you have a system that is not full production within the season, within that year of the budget, then you might need multiple budgets. And so you would have a budget for the year that you're planting, because there's going to be very different revenue and costs the year that you're planting. Then a budget for the establishment years, where you have very different inputs and certainly very different yields and revenue for those years. And then a budget for full production. And that allows you really, like, when you take all of the sum of those budgets, it gives you a much better sense, really, of what the multi-year costs and benefits of that, revenues and costs of that system are likely to be. And I see that there's a question. Is there a recommended number of enterprises per farm considering the size of the business, or as a rule of thumb? No. There really isn't. It's really going to be, because it's really going to be what you can handle as a business owner. It depends on the quality or the level of data that you're able to track and handle. And so I would say that, and really it's also what utility you're going to get out of it. And so really it's the number of enterprise budgets should be based on the number of the management sort of decisions that you need information to make decisions around. I would say if you have activities that are very different, so like if you have both a, like Apple production, and then you also do a value added business, you'll have better manage. You if you create two enterprise budgets, an enterprise for the production side, and an enterprise for the value added side, that would make the processing side. That would give you a lot better data than if you lump those all together because they have very different revenues and very different cost structures. Generally, you want to develop enterprise budgets around the profit centers as you've defined the profit centers for your business. I guess that would be my overall rule of thumb. But once again, you define those profit centers because those are how you they both depend on like how many you have, but also how how you make decisions around them. One thing with enterprise budgets, because they're offering, if you're developing enterprise budgets, it's generally because you want to be able to compare one enterprise to a different enterprise, or maybe your enterprise to, sort of industry performance standards. You need to choose a unit of production, and that's standard. And that's also so that you can then sort of, really be able to evaluate performance. And as an example, like if I have a 22-acre peach orchard and I get $154,000 in revenue and my costs are $61,000, my profits $92,000. And my 79-acre apple orchard, I have $790,000 in revenue and costs of $415,000, and my profits $374. What's my more profitable orchard, right? I mean, obviously I get more off the apple orchard just as a dollar amount, but as far as per acre return on my investment, like it's kind of hard to tell. Maybe some people can do that math in their head. Most of us can't. But if you divide it into per acre profit, it really allows you then to compare the peaches and the apples sort of head to head. That I'm getting $4,700 an acre for the apples, and I'm getting $4,199 for the peaches. So that's the reason that ultimately when you're doing an enterprise budget, you're going to be thinking about the unit that you want to be able to compare it to. So the other thing is you choose often you'll define the units, and that will depend on your enterprise, how you collect data. In some cases, in some industries, you cut fruit in bushels, and that's how you sell it. Sometimes it's in hundredweight, sometimes it's in tons, sometimes it's in gallons. So you really, you picking the way you'll routinely sell or use, that commodity will affect what unit you choose. Per acre is useful when you're comparing to enterprises that both use land resources but are sold in different units, because at least the per acre gives you, something that's comparable. So if you've got one crop that's sold per bushel and one that's sold per hundredweight, at least if you both do the returns per acre, that gives you a sense of that. If your focus is your return on your land investment also, then a per acre comparison makes some sense. But if your focus is on if your focus is on what is most cost effective to produce, comparing them, I think, by the units of sale also can make sense. That it might be harder to really sort of think about it as far as per acre, when actually what you want to know is for every bushel I'm selling, what is my return? So it kind of depends on what you want to focus on. But definitely you should be choosing a unit of production that you can actually get the data relatively simply in. You don't have to do it per acre. I mean, I guess that's in a nutshell. You can do it. It might be more relevant to you to have it, based on the unit of sale rather than on the unit of production. But for whatever that, enterprise budgets, they have this very similar format to other types of budgets, right? You first want to know you want to estimate your total production level, output or yield, and your expected output price. And then you're going to estimate your variable costs. And as we talked about, variable costs are those costs that are specific to the specific inputs you use to produce a unit of the crop, or product to the point of sale. And one way to decide if it's a variable cost or not is if you didn't produce the crop that year, would you have any costs in that like would you have that cost? So if you if you own farmland, for example, and you don't plant anything that year, you still owe property taxes. You still, if you have bought equipment and you've got loans on it, you still have to pay the interest on those loans, whether or not you grow anything or not. You might have some utilities that you have regardless of what you grow. You have maybe you have some staff even that are there regardless of where over time you would end up letting them go because you're not bringing in any money. But in the short run, like within that year or for that crop, you're really looking at those things that are specifically going into that crop. Those are your variable costs, and those two kinds of costs. We talked about earlier direct costs. And those are costs that you can directly attribute to that enterprise. You know exactly how much of that cost is going straight into that enterprise. You've got exact numbers. You know. Indirect costs are ones where you don't know exactly how much is going into that enterprise. So you have to allocate it to the enterprise. And so that could be something like fertilizer that you buy, and so in your budget you've got fertilizer and you use it over multiple enterprises. So you don't know like exactly what the cost is for Gala apples. So you would have to but that if you didn't grow Gala apples, you wouldn't use that fertilizer. So it is a variable cost. You just have to decide like, okay, how much am I, using per year? Like how much am I putting in? And you'll have to do some sort of an allocation. Labor is a good example, right? Like you might have employees that work on many different enterprises. So if you don't track their labor by enterprise, it can be challenging to sort of say like, how much labor am I using for every enterprise? But if you weren't doing that, you wouldn't have any labor costs. And so that would be one where you'd have to make some allocation about like how much labor is going here, how much labor is going there. Those indirect costs can be, they can be more difficult. So I would say if the usage of that input is small, or if the cost of that input is a minor cost overall, a ballpark estimation is probably good enough. So an expense that's small could just be divided evenly among all your enterprises or allocated based on acres or something like that. So if there's some input, and you only use a little bit of it, you could just say like, okay, like I use, I've got 10 acres in production and this is 20% of my acres in production. So I'm just going to take, I don't know if it's really 20% I use on that, but I'm just going to say it's 20%. And that's good enough because it doesn't really make that much of a difference, and that kind of estimation is good overall. On the other hand, if an expense is really large and it's likely to have an impact on the profitability of the enterprise, and I think labor, in fruit and vegetables is a really good example of that, then you really do need to take more care in allocation when you're doing an enterprise budget. And so identifying ways to track time per enterprise, even for a season or even for a few representative weeks, can give you a better handle on how your enterprises differ in their contribution to overall profitability of your farm. And so, you definitely want to put in your variable costs for your indirect costs, you want to put your effort in being careful to allocate those costs as close to being a direct cost as you can, and that will help you be more accurate. And then you want to assign the share of fixed costs, and those are your overhead costs. And you're likely with fixed costs to be doing some type of cost allocation process. Insurance, land and property taxes, sort of overhead supplies. Those are things that you probably use on multiple enterprises, and you just want to figure out, based on some allocation formula, how you want to charge those off. And then you want to assign the share of depreciation of equipment. So it could be that there's some equipment that's only used in one enterprise, so all of the depreciation would go for that enterprise. There's going to be other equipment that's shared among different enterprises, and you're going to want to once again come up with a way of allocating that depreciation cost. So enterprise budgets, one thing that you can do with enterprise budgets is that cooperative extension has, for many different crops and systems, developed enterprise budget templates, because often with enterprise budgets, having them in Excel and being able to manipulate them is like really half of what you want to do, and a lot of the value to an enterprise budget. So what you can do is you can Google crop, enterprise budget, and extension. And I say crop, but like what crop you're looking for, what kind of a system you're looking for, and then enterprise budget and extension, and you should get some. For tree fruit, Washington State and Penn State both have enterprise budgets for apples and for tree fruit. There's a pretty good database of enterprise budgets at University of Minnesota. If you do agrisk.com, agrisk.umn.edu/budgets, you can actually search enterprise budgets. And I'll pull that website up before we go just so you can see that. But the key when you're looking at an enterprise budget is you want to start with the most similar system to what you're doing and then modify it from there. So you want to definitely look at the assumptions that are built into different enterprise budgets, because you'll find that there are some enterprise budgets that are built for really small farms. There are some budgets that are built for larger, really larger commercial farms. There are organic budgets. And so that's the one thing that you want to do, is just because it's an apple budget or a peach budget or, a cider making budget, you also then want to go and look at like what assumptions they've built into that budget and then modify it for your own. So when you have a budget, and I'll show you this on the Washington State does a good job with this. When you have a budget, an enterprise budget, you can then do enterprise analysis. And one of the things that you can do when you've developed an enterprise budget is a break-even price analysis, and that's when you estimate your. It can help you determine if how an enterprise is contributing to overall profitability of the farm. So what you do is you would calculate your break-even return, and that's the return that you would get. What in this case it's dollars per bin, in order for you to cover your costs. And so, for example, with this enterprise budget, they've calculated that total variable costs are $32,000, $32,372. Total cash costs, so this would be the variable costs plus most of the fixed costs, are $33,017.67. The total cash cost plus depreciation is $34,266, and then the total cost, and this is with with depreciation, and then they've also added interest and a management cost. So this gets you the full economic cost, and that would be if you were, gives you a sense of like compared to sort of your other options. Are you still, is it still profitable? So these are calculated from your enterprise budget, and then that if your net yield, your bins per acre is $64, at your break even, in order to cover your total variable costs, you would need to get $505 per bin in order to cover your total your total cash costs, or your this is where you're just covering your variable costs. And so if you are making less than $505.82, you're losing money for every unit that you're making. Every bin you produce, you're losing money, because it's costing your input costs just to make to grow those apples are costing you more than you're actually getting for the apples. At $515, so that would be the 64 bins per acre divided by the 33,000. At this price, you're covering your variable costs plus all of your fixed costs also. And so at this level, you're covering all of the direct expenses to grow the crop, but you're not making enough at this point to sort of reinvest or maintain the crop. So now you add depreciation, and those are all of your equipment. So that's the money that you have that that your depreciation allows you to have the money sort of in your assets to buy new equipment, to upgrade your orchards, those sort of costs. You would need to be making $535 a bin in order to now have enough money to cover all of your direct costs, plus those costs of sort of maintaining the business over time. So you could stay in business over time, upgrade your infrastructure, replace your equipment, if you're making at least this much per bin. And then at $658 a bin is when you're now also covering the interest costs, your management costs. So if you assume that you want a 5% return or a 20% return or whatever you've determined your management cost is, that's what you would need to receive in order to make that level. So this sort of break-even pricing out, like once you've developed your enterprise budget, this is a type of analysis that you can do in order to have a sense of like, okay, at this sort of yield that I would expect, what kind of returns do I need to be seeing in order to really know if my business is likely to be sustainable in the long run. And then you can also do a sensitivity analysis, and so you can look at over a bunch of different assumptions about prices per bin and yields. What are my likely net returns to be, like per acre to be. And this is one that they've done for Washington Washington State has done for Honeycrisp. So you can see that with this sensitivity analysis, that it's only at either a net yield of over 63 bins per acre, and above $691 per bin, are you actually seeing positive net returns per acre. And so that, and that's, and so that gives you a sense also of the, how risky the enterprise is, right? Because if you're only seeing positive returns at, sort of higher prices and higher yields, you have to ask yourself, how likely is that? So that would give you a sense of like, okay, is this an enterprise that I'm very likely to see positive returns for, or an enterprise that I'm less likely to see positive returns for. And you can see with this one they've set it up so that you can also adjust what the interest rates are and what the overhead costs are. Because that will also change, these numbers here will change based on your assumptions in this area. And they also have the pack out equivalent. They have a 75% pack out equivalent. Maybe your pack out rate is higher, right? So you could adjust that up and that would change these numbers. So I'm going to actually go to the Washington. Does anybody have any questions so far? I'm going to pull up the Washington State enterprise budget. So you can get a sense of if you were to download an enterprise budget from one of the universities, what they all, some are more detailed than others, but how you can modify them then in order to be able to use that information with your farm's data in order to do these types of analysis and assessments of your farm business. So while I pull that up, if anybody has any questions while I'm doing that, feel free to type them in the chat box. Okay, let me stop sharing. And I'm going to go over. Okay. I'm going to share the screen. And share. So this is an example of a spreadsheet that you can download from the Washington State University, and this is their cost of establishing, producing, and packing Gala apples in Washington in 2019. And so they have, Washington State has done these for a variety of different apple varieties. They've done it for Gala, Honeycrisp, Fuji, I think Crippen's Pink or whatever. I've seen enterprise budgets for cider apples from different universities. But this is a good example. This is actually a good example of what you can find in some university enterprise budgets that actually are not that hard then to modify for yourself. Because as you know, I mean, if you're growing in New York State, Washington State has different conditions. They may have very different assumptions. On the other hand, there may be a lot of similarities too, and so there's no sense in reinventing the wheel when you can just modify, what they've done. I'm also going to make this, maybe I'll make this a little bit bigger, just in case the type is tiny. All right, so that should make that a little bigger. If you can't see this, if the numbers are too small, type it in the chat box. So the first thing you want to do whenever you're looking at an enterprise budget that you've downloaded is you want to see exactly what they've assumed, right? Because your farm, and then see how that lines up to your farm or where you might have to make some modifications. So they're telling you, for example, on how to use it, that the values in orange are provided, that those are the values that you can change, and then anything in black is calculated and shouldn't be modified. That you want to, the main data source for calculations is Appendix 5, data for tables, and by changing the orange colored values in Appendix 5, it'll automatically change the values in the remaining worksheets. So that would probably be where you would want to start. And then they have a bunch of budget assumptions, but when you go actually to their to their assumptions, you can see that you can modify a lot of their budget assumptions. So they're assuming that the total farm operation is 300 acres and that it's got 225 acres of apples, that the budget is based on a 55-acre gala block. It's assuming that 5% of the block is dedicated to road, pond, loading areas, and buildings. So it's a 52-acre block. They have $18,000 as the value of the land. So it goes through. They have, like what their labor rates are. They also have the block specifications. And so this would be something you would want to look at to say, like, do you have 4 foot in row spacing? Do you do 10 feet in between the row spacing? What kind of root stock do you have? The block size, the life of the planting, the tree density, and the trellis system. So you can modify these things, for your farm, and make the budget more like yours. So the first thing I would do if I opened up this enterprise budget is I would go over to the data for the tables, because this is going to be where I'm going to see whether their assumptions and my assumptions are all similar. So these are the gross returns per bin that they're assuming. This is year 1 is the establishment year. Year 2 is these are the years that you're getting up to up to full production. But these will be the same every year because this is just the price of the crop, right? So this is not necessarily what you're going to get. This is just like, this is what the crops, you're assuming the price of the crop is that year. And then this is what you're assuming that your production is. So in year 1, when you're planting the plants, you don't have any production. Year 2, you don't have any production. Year 3, you're assuming a little bit of production. Year 4, a little bit of production. Year 5, a little bit more production. Then finally, year 6, and then through 20, because this is assuming a 20-year system, that you would have 80 bins, 80 bins per acre. And they tell you, the other thing is under the notes, this is based on a 925 pound bin. And they also give you in their notes that their range for sensitivity, their suggestion is that a range for sensitivity analysis would be 60 bins to 100 bins per acre during full production. So they're saying that in their experience that most farms are going to be somewhere in the 60 to 100. So right now it's 80, but you could change this, to, if I could change this number to, 90, and if I did that, this would flow through the entire budget. In fact, I can show you right now. But this, they had it at 80, and if we go to their budget, you can see that their total returns at full production is $30,784 dollars per acre. So if I go back to the data for the tables and I change this now to let's just say 95, it should, if there is, unless I've screwed something up. See, now you have 36,000. So it'll change it based on what data, because you can, if you look on this, you can see that this is a formula H5 times, yeah, so this is where they pull the data for the 76 up here, the net production. All right, anyway. So go back to, so the other thing, so yeah, so what I would do if I were downloading this and I were going to use this enterprise budget as a starting point for my farm, is I would go through and I would take I would be looking at my financial information, and I would be looking at, and thinking about my farm, and then I would be looking at this and saying, okay, what here, do I have any categories, like, for example, do I use beehive, I guess you probably, or irrigation, do I use what do I have a pond, do I have do I use sunburn protection, do I have that on my farm or not? Things that you don't have, you can just make all zeros, or just if you don't want to screw with the budget, or you can or you could delete it if you want to check the formulas to see how that would affect the overall budget. The safer thing is generally to just make something a zero if you don't have it. That way you don't have to worry that you're going to screw a calculation up somewhere else. The other thing that you can do is you can change the you can sort of change the if you wanted to add like specific herbicides or whatever. I would, if you wanted to put your, you could look at your herbicides and then make a note here of like exactly what your assumptions were as far as your herbicide materials, like what materials are you using, what were the rates that you're assuming, and then put that total, change the totals here instead. And so anyway, I guess my point is that by changing this and adapting this for your system, you can then have it flow through and have an enterprise budget without having to create a whole new spreadsheet. The other thing that's nice about this one is that they, not only do they have the budget, once they have this one automatically will calculate a price and yield analysis based on the budget numbers that you put in. And then you can change these numbers and it'll change the calculation also. So if you wanted to see what the yield would be then, like if I'm assuming this is now like 90, you can see that, I can run, I can see, okay, so what if I had like a theoretical 120? Am I ever profitable? So I can change these numbers and then have, and actually see, and do some, some sensitivity analysis, estimated net returns, the break-even return. I can, by my Gala budget, this Gala budget. You can also look, the other thing is if you want to know where they get the number that's black, if by clicking on that number and looking at the formula, I can see this comes from the tab Gala Budget H5. And so I go to Gala Budget and I look at H5, and that's full production. So in order for me to change this number, I would need to then change my the full production number I changed earlier on. So if I change For the break-even return, you can see this is assuming 64 bins per acre. If I changed here my full production, let's just make it 100. I should then have my, yeah, you can see that this is now 80 bins per acre. And so you have at 80 bins per acre, you know, I'm profitable at lower prices than I was before when it was, you know, when this was $64 an acre. This one, you know, gives you a sense of the capital requirements. They allow you to put in the different machinery and the purchase price. You can adjust these numbers, and by adjusting these numbers, that will change the depreciation assumptions in the budget. So this initial costing depreciation pulls from your machinery and building. And so anyway, I guess my sort of, this is sort of a long-winded way of saying that by downloading an enterprise budget from a university and then modifying it based on your farm, it can tell you what you need to have in a budget. It can give you a sense of some of the categories that you might not have considered, and it can help sort of give you a structure for pulling your own numbers then out of your financial information to create an enterprise budget. And hopefully you can see, especially when when you start to see some of the things like the break-even analysis, is not only do you have an enterprise budget, you have a sense of like an enterprise analysis, because if you can then compare, you know, this budget that you've done for Gala, you can also have a budget for, you know, in fact Washington State does. They have a budget for Honeycrisp, and you can also say like, okay, at this labor rate, how does Gala compare with Honeycrisp? At this level of fertilizer cost, how does Gala compare with Honeycrisp? And it allows you then to sort of compare these different enterprises head to head, and determine like maybe where you want to, maybe where you want to invest. And I think the other thing it really gives you a sense of like, you know, I think this is the part that can be really helpful, is if you see that you're looking at negative returns over like most of going forward over the next 20 years, over the next, over a reasonable number of prices and a reasonable number of yield expectations, this might not be an enterprise that you would want to invest a lot of money in. You know, this might be something you'd say, oh, well, this is not looking good. This is looking pretty risky. Let me see if I can, look at some other enterprises that might have a better estimated net return over reasonable yields and reasonable prices over an amount of time. So I often one of the uses that I have for enterprise budgets, as somebody who gives advice to people, but also I think the recommended use for an enterprise budget for a farm is to help you not put money into things that are unlikely under reasonable scenarios to give you a reasonable return. I think a lot of times people get very fixated on the best possible scenario at the best possible price, and they run the numbers, and it seems like it could be a good option. But by having a good enterprise budget and then doing some of these sensitivity analysis, you might realize, oh yeah, I mean, it could make money, but it's more likely not going to make money. And there might be options that actually have a better return for me. So that is pretty much what I have for enterprise budgets. And I guess with that, I'll open it up to questions if anybody has any. I will say that the most challenging thing with enterprise budgets is when you have all of your costs and expenses in a lump, and you have to go through that allocation process. I think that's where enterprise budgets really become challenging. And I think, one takeaway or one tip that I would give is to really focus that allocation on those things that are most likely to be the difference between profitability or not profitability, or not being profitable. Those are the things that are the largest expenses. within your systems, those are the ones that I would focus on really doing very careful allocations of. And then if you don't have a system that will allow you to do time tracking easily, and to go out for a season, and at least during a representative week for each of the different practices, getting a sense of how long it takes, then you can at least have a handle on some information that can help you do allocation. Last week's recordings are still slowly being uploaded. I will have a link for you. I know I've said this several times already, but I definitely promise that I will have a link for you tomorrow to get all of last week's recordings and then all of the recordings going forward. Internet has definitely been quite slow in our home in the last few days, so I apologize for that. Any other questions? So, great. Well, if not, tomorrow we're going to take a little shift away from enterprise, from budgeting and financials, and we're going to talk about sort of a process for making decisions, and really sort of structuring, a structured process for when you're trying to decide among different financial investments. And then after that, we're going to delve right back into things that are a lot more calculation. We're going to do sensitivity analysis, and cost price. God, I can tell that it's lunchtime because I'm starting to get hungry. But cost price, volume analysis, and then on the last day we're going to do helping you figure out how to do net present value, internal rate of return, and other types of analysis to help you sort of also once again evaluate, sort of look at two different or multiple different investment opportunities. So with that, I will hopefully see you all tomorrow.